Welcome back to another Quick Truth. My name is Derek Truesdale, and this week I want to cover another chapter of that same book from last week, Knowing God. Last week we covered the chapter that talked about God being unchangeable. This week I want to talk about the chapter that talks about God's wisdom. And as that chapter starts, it talks about this is what wisdom really is. Wisdom is choosing the best possible goal and then choosing the best means to achieve that goal. So how that looks for us, choosing the best possible thing to achieve and then finding out how do we do that, how do we achieve that goal. It also can look like just the practical side of moral goodness. So if morally you understand what morals are, you try to live a good life, that living out of those morals can be considered wisdom as well. It's also a very important part of God's character, which is why it's in the book Knowing God. So that's wisdom. But as we look at the concept of wisdom, there's a difference between God's wisdom and our wisdom. And the really big difference is that we are limited in what we can achieve and the goals that we can make and how we can achieve those goals. So that's the big difference there. We can make plans all we want, and that's good to make plans and to have things laid out and try to have goals that we can achieve and try to, figure out the best way to get there. But life can happen and it can mess those things up. And that's because we're finite, because we're human and we're limited to the things that happen to us, and we have to roll with the punches and just kind of go with it. And I've heard this quote from a poem. It says, "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." And it reminded me of the book, I believe by Steinbeck, called Of Mice and Men, where the two main characters have a plan and they're going to achieve that plan, but then life just hits them from all of the different sides and it's just a bad end for the two guys in the end. And that's what happens to us in our life sometimes. We make the best plans and we want to achieve these things and we have the right heart behind it, and sometimes life says, no, this is not, and you have to adjust to that. And that's because we're human, because we are limited. The difference is with God, he's not limited in those ways. So his goal that he chooses is going to be the perfect goal because he has all knowledge. And then in order to achieve that goal, he has all energy, all strength, and all power. He can do whatever it takes to achieve that goal. So his wisdom is going to be the absolute perfect wisdom because he's not limited in any of those ways. But how does that God's wisdom, how does that look in our lives? How does it play out in our lives? Does it automatically mean that if we become a follower of God, that life's going to be smooth sailing? God died for me. He wants my best. So it's going to be easy from here on out because I'm following God. But we all know that that's not how it looks. Like, it doesn't just become smooth sailing after you become a Christian. We still have a lot of trials we have to go through. And that's what, happens in our lives. And if we're expecting it to be smooth sailing, if we think we're not going to have any problems because we're following God, then we're going to be disheartened and disillusioned when we do hit those things, because they are coming. They exist and we have to be ready for those things. So how do we react when those things happen? They are happening in our lives because God wants to grow us. And that's the only way that we can grow, is through these trials and struggles that he gives us. So his wisdom is perfect, and he's giving us these things to help us be conformed more to the image of his son. So how do we react when these things happen? Do we get disillusioned? We shouldn't. We should react in this way. We should learn what we can from the trials and the struggles. We should react positively to them in the best way that we can. I've heard it said this way: take the best and leave the rest. So you take what you can learn, apply that to your life, and so when this happens, you can say, next time, when this similar things happen, I'm going to be ready for that because I've learned from this situation and I'm going to apply it here. We can do that and then leave the other stuff behind. Don't get angry or bitter at that thing because, that's going to hurt you in the long run. So leave that there and take the best and run with that. Also, I've heard Elon Musk says when one of his rockets explodes, he calls it an unscheduled dismantling, because obviously he didn't want that to happen, but because it did, he now knows more data about those rockets and what he should do next time. And we can apply that to any area of our life. Things aren't always going to play out the way we think or want them to, but when they don't, learn from that and don't just let it, sideline you and make you angry. When it happens, learn from that and apply it to next time. And that's how we grow. That's how we take these struggles and make them a benefit to ourselves. We see three main, examples in the Old Testament. There's many examples, but I chose these three because they're in the chapter of the book. But it talks about Abraham, who went through a bunch of hard times, and through all these things, he went from Abram, which is a man of the world, to Abraham, a man of God. And it involves going through the land of Canaan, but not actually inheriting any of it himself. Only his children would inherit it. It involves, God requesting for him to sacrifice his own son, which he was willing to do. He says, I'm willing to go through this trial because I want God more than anything else in my life. So he was willing to do it. He didn't have to in the end, but he was willing to do it. So these trials led him to be more like Christ. Also, Jacob goes through a bunch of different trials. And at the end of it, he's always been so self-reliant, Jacob has. And at the end, he finally gets defeated. And he's wrestling with God, and God just dislocates his hip automatically. And then, he will not let go of God until he gets a blessing. But he's been completely humbled. And he comes back a humble man, and he's never the same after that night. And it took a lot in his life to bring him to that point. But when we're self-reliant, we run into a bunch of different things. And sometimes God uses situations in our lives to change us, to become more like him. And that's in those points when we are defeated, we can accept, we accept humility and we become closer to God. Another example is Joseph. So a bunch of negative things happen to Joseph. He goes to jail, but eventually through all his trials and struggles, he becomes second in Egypt only to Pharaoh. So all these trials that these men went through, they didn't just, sit back and say, oh, my life's just not that great and just, live it, in a defeated way. They said, God's growing me through these things. So I need to keep trying my best. I need to keep learning and keep, pursuing a relationship with God and becoming more like Christ. So what can we take away from this lesson, this chapter of this book? What can we, take away from the wisdom of God? And I think it's these things here. We can know that when we go through hard times in our lives, that we're not alone. That it's always been like this. In the Old Testament, it was like that. In the New Testament, you have Paul, went through a ton of trials. You have Jesus, who went through a ton of trials and became, it says in Hebrews 5:8-9, it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So through his suffering, he became perfect in the source of eternal salvation. That's Jesus himself. And then there's also a quote here that I like. It says, for it is often the case, as all the saints know, that fellowship with the Father and the Son is most vivid and sweet, and Christian joy is greatest when the cross is heaviest. So when the situation is so difficult, when we don't feel like we have it in us to keep going, and we can't make it through these trials, it's then that we get closer to God, and that brings us, in more alignment with who God wants us to be. So we know that we're not alone. This has happened Old Testament, New Testament, it happens today. It's always been the case that when the cross is heaviest is when we grow the most. So we can take these trials and really accept them and use them as opportunities to grow into more of what God wants us to be. So how do we gain this wisdom? How do we learn from God's wisdom? 3 things. We should study the Bible and just see these examples for ourselves. And then we should pray. And then we should say with Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, that we can learn his grace is sufficient for us. This has been another Quick Truth. Thanks for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next time.